And welcome back to the show. I'm Chris McCarthy. Thank you so much for joining me here on WBSM, which, of course, you can hear us stream us live on our YouTube site as well as WBSM.com. And we're going to be joined here by Michele McPhee. Michele is the author of Maximum Harm. She's a friend of the show, and she's a super investigative reporter. We're going to talk about two things here. The Boston Marathon, which she's really one of the experts, probably knows more about it than law enforcement, certainly more than law enforcement will admit. And that's what her book, Maximum Harm, is about, the marathon bombing. And then, of course, we're going to have to talk about the story that she broke, which is about the murder of Whitey Bulger. Good morning, Michele. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me. It's always nice to be on with you, Chris.
So, Michele, we scheduled this yesterday, and then, of course, we found out about the deportation of one of the after participants of the marathon bombing. Why don't you let the folks know what's going on?
So you might recall that this individual was one of the participants in the aftermath of the Boston Marathon because he had taken the brothers out to dinner. He lied about it. Then he tried to cover up his actions, and he's one of the 4 peripheral players that has now been deported.
And he's gone back to Kazakhstan, is that correct?
In Kazakhstan, yes.
Kazakhstan. So he served years. Now, do we know whether or not he had advance notice of the bombing, or was it just only after the fact?
Well, so no, when he was never charged with being in any way connected to the bombing. What he was convicted of is conspiracy to obstruct justice and obstruction of justice. You might recall that these are the guys, and there was a lot of discussion about whether or not they could have saved Sean Collier's life, because instead of calling the police when they recognized their classmate, Jahar Tsarnaev, they went to his dorm room. And you might recall that Diaz was the one who was texting with Jahar, like, ha, 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 I saw you on the news.
Unbelievable. Of course, it was UMass Dartmouth.
And Jahar wrote back, hey, dude, a smiley face, you can go to my room and take whatever you want. So Diaz, along with 2 other classmates who were convicted in this case, went to Jahar's dorm room. They grabbed a backpack. They threw it in a dumpster in their New Bedford building. It took cops about 2 days to find it, going through the dump, a big landfill. And in the end, sure enough, there was discarded fireworks pieces and that notorious white hat, the Ralph Lauren hat that Jahar was wearing when he smirked standing next to the tree after he slid that bomb off his shoulder, the bomb that killed Martin Richard, 8 years old, and Lindsay Lou, and maimed so many other people, friends of mine.
We're speaking with Michele McPhee, who's the author of Maximum Harm, which is the definitive book on the Boston Marathon bombing. We're talking about the deportation of one of the post-bombing members of that team. And, of course, it was at UMass Dartmouth and in New Bedford right here in our listening audience where a lot of this stuff took place.
Yeah, so in those guys, I mean, there was a lot more to that story. If they had called authorities and said, we recognize them. Now, you and I both know that I don't believe for a second that not a single person recognized 2 people who live in a city, including one who was walking around a college campus. Those photos went out at 5 p.m. We know that Sean Collier was assassinated around 10:30 p.m. on Thursday, in the days after the Boston Marathon, Thursday, April 18th, at 2013. Does it stretch credibility to you that no one recognized those guys?
Well, we think someone did recognize them, right? Isn't that a major situation that took place in the hangar?
Yes, exactly. We think that the FBI
recognized
them.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
Which of course they should have. Even if they didn't, it's bad. If they did, they're liars. So they're in a lose-lose situation with that scenario because they had an open investigation into Tamla Tsarnaev and have been to his house on Norfolk Ave multiple times. A house that, coincidentally just happened to be owned by a one-time KGB defector who was the Russian studies teacher for Graham Fuller, a high-ranking CIA official who helped the family get into the country via Turkey.
It's a wild story, folks. You have to read Maximum Harm. It really is a fantastic book. And Michele, is there anything going on with that book?
Actually, it's funny. We're pitching right now a docu-series with a great company in Hollywood. So stay tuned because that could turn into a multi-part investigative documentary.
Fantastic, fantastic. So, Michele, the original reason I called you was because you broke the story on Whitey Bulger being murdered in Hazleton Prison in the federal system. Now, you have been on top of the story from the beginning. You think you at least know the names of some of the suspects. Why don't you tell the folks what you've learned, and then I've got some serious questions for you.
Okay, so I don't want to get into the names of any suspects as of yet,
Okay.
but what I will tell you is that, there is talk of a very well-known Charlestown bank robber. There's obviously we know about the Springfield Genovese crime family hitman, and then of course there's the South Shore mobster who's also connected to a couple of bank jobs. And there's Cadillac Frank Salemi's partner, who was just recently convicted of a 1993 murder that you and I have talked about many times. His name is Paul Wiedek. The bigger question to me is, okay, the quotes I'm getting from law enforcement over and over is Boston owned the yard at this prison in West Virginia called Hazleton. If Boston owned the yard, in every other scenario, you and I both know.
Michele, tell people what that means for those of them who don't know what Boston owns a yard means.
That means that Boston pretty much runs the prison. And by owning the yard, when you go out for rec time, whoever is the most powerful, for lack of a better term, gang or group, it's just like Oz, which wasn't. You remember how awesome Oz was?
It was a great, great TV show, HBO.
Yeah, HBO, fabulous. And I'm rewriting it because I have the great honor of writing for Tom Fontana as we speak.
Oh.
And I'm rereading it, rewatching it. And if you think about it, running the yard means that you are the most powerful of all the groups in there. And of course, there's a hierarchy. There's the mobsters, there's the gangbangers, there's ethnic groups. But Boston owns the yard meant that Boston had a pretty big presence and ran the entire prison system. So why the Federal Bureau of Prisons would move a guy like Whitey Bulger into a hornet's nest of his enemies from Boston, that's the bigger question for me. I'm not shocked that these people put a lock in a sock and beat him until he was unrecognizable, tried to cut his tongue out and gouged his eye out. What I really would love to know is how this was orchestrated to happen in the first place. Now, let me be clear. I'm not crying any tears over Whitey. Screw him. He's a despicable rat and a murderer who, inflicted so much harm on so many families in Boston and dealt drugs and kids who jumped off roofs. Is just the collateral damage that Whitey Bulger is responsible for. It goes beyond any sort of, you can't even, tabulate it. But what I do know is that there's something stinks to high heaven about this, and you have to ask questions. It's just like the Boston Marathon. Who were the players in the marathon? Bob Mueller. He was the director of the FBI until when? April 2013. He quit right after the Boston Marathon. And if people remember their history in Boston, Mueller was a key player in the Whitey Bulger debacle back in the early 1990s when he was here working in Boston.
We're speaking with Michele McPhee, who's the author of Maximum Harm about the Boston Marathon bombing, but also she's done numerous other books, and she's really an expert on New England and New York organized crime. Michele, let me ask you a question. I know you're not saying names. I've said a couple of names, but they're in the press, but I didn't. Is any of those suspects in the missing artwork from the Isabella Gardner Museum?
That story is so complicated. Really, the biggest name that I know in that Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum case is a guy named Mark Rossetti, who we know was also working for the FBI as an informant. So it is really interesting. I'm working on a story right now for Newsweek called Snitch Fellas. And going through some of the paperwork from the early 1970s and then in the 1990s, it seems that the FBI had a pretty good scheme, I'll call it, going on where they would create a crew of rats. For example, Whitey Bulger, Cadillac Frank Salemi, Stevie Flemmi. So these were all guys who were on the FBI's payroll. And then they spark a war. And guys like Michael Romano and his associates went to prison or died. And Jula was taken down. And who rose to the very top of the heap for Boston underworld's organized crime? The FBI informant crew. Well, if you look at the same history in New York City, around the same time, from 91 to 93, there was a Colombo War. And this was bloody. There were bodies on both sides. And now you find out that guys like Greg Scarpa, known as the Grim Reaper, he was an FBI informant. And there are other people that I'm about to reveal as informants, which you'll read about soon. And it's the same story, where you had a crew of FBI informants. There's a mob war. The FBI informants win. So essentially, the FBI is controlling the mafia via these tactics, where the people who are rising in the ranks of the New York City crime families, at least in the Colombo family, and in Boston, were people who were on the FBI's payroll. And the same handlers are in all of these cases. It's Lynn Del Vecchio, dirty. They tried to lock him up. It didn't work because he was protected by the FBI. Then you have, obviously, H. Paul Rico. What do you want? Tears? He famously testified when he was confronted with all the people who died because of his corruption in the FBI. And, of course, there's also John Morris, who mysteriously gets a promotion and gets shipped out to L.A., to the field office for the FBI in L.A. that just happens to be a couple of miles away from the Santa Monica hideout of Whitey Bulger. And you really wonder what Whitey knew about the people who are now, involved in a pretty high profile investigation.
Very interesting. We're speaking with Michele McPhee about the death of Whitey Bulger. So, Michele, so we've heard various stories, and of course it's fog of war right now. There's all kinds of things being put out there. They're saying, some people are saying anyway, that Whitey Bulger requested to be in general population. Would that matter? Would they adhere to his request? I mean, it seems like, right? Is that ridiculous?
That's like requesting, buttercream cake from Magnolia Bakery. Give me a break.
So he ends up in probably the most dangerous place in the world he could end up, in a wheelchair.
Literally, the most dangerous place in the world. And this guy has never been in Gen Pop, ever. And he's only been in the prison for 4 hours when he's killed. And he's not in a hospital unit. It's just, you know what it smacks of? We all remember Joseph Drusi and his murder of Father Gagan, which nobody was crying about. And they tried to jam up some prison officials for that. But, hey, oops, a door got left open. It shouldn't have been left open.
Right, Paul Gagan was a famous child molester.
Wow, we don't have, Whitey wrote a letter to a Taunton teacher named Jack Kelly, and in it he talked about how he has to live with this camera in a ceiling 24 hours a day, and he has no privacy. So that happened in Coleman, in his last facility in Florida. It doesn't happen there. That makes no sense.
It's a very interesting case. How long do you think, or ever, maybe never, will we find out the investigative report on this?
I would say probably around the same time that we find out who really built the Boston Marathon bombs.
I suspect you're right. I know I mentioned yesterday when I was telling the listeners you were going to be on about the investigation to Mark Rossetti, the East Boston Mafia member who was also a government informant and suspect in numerous murders, heroin dealer, just the worst of the worst. And it turns out he's an FBI informant. Stephen Lynch asks for an investigation. That investigation is never, if it's been done, it's never seen the light of day.
And he wrote legislation that's never passes that would require accountability from federal officials when dealing with the top echelon informants. Crazy. The damage that informants have done all over. I mean, you find out that the father of the Pulse nightclub shooter was an FBI informant. It goes on and on and on. The guy who just was involved in owning the limousine company where all the people were killed in the traffic accident. He's an FBI informant. And you haven't heard any follow-up stories on that. So it's really interesting how these inexplicable stories, the mass shooting in Las Vegas, the Pulse nightclub, there's very little follow-up when it involves some of these FBI informants. Well, Michele, I haven't read anything about that. Did they even drag him out of Pakistan yet? The owner of the limo company? No, I don't think so. I don't know. But where's the follow-up? Right. There's no follow-up. Like 22 people, members of the same family, die at a wedding, and nobody cares. No, it's unbelievable. Well, Michele, I'm going to let you go. I'm going to give people how to get to you. It's Michele with one L, McPhee.com. Of course, we'll have a video of this up, folks, this interview with ways to follow Michele on Twitter, which is, again, Michele with one E, at Michele McPhee on Twitter. You should definitely follow her on Twitter because she's going to give you updates on all this stuff that's going on. It seems like you're at the forefront of a couple of the biggest stories going on in this country right now. Again, Michele. Well, thank you. You are so nice to me, and I appreciate it. And you're like the real mob expert, so it's always good to be on with you. Now you're going to get me hurt over the weekend. Well, if I end up getting a dumpster, I think it's going to be more likely it was a
I know.
There was people. It's not going to be the mob.
No. Well, it'll be the other mob.
Exactly.
Michele, thanks a lot.
Thank
have
you
a great day.
very much.
And listen,
Have a good one.
bye. Thanks. Yeah, Michelle's doing all kinds of great stuff. You should follow her. Go to her website. Follow her on Twitter. She's doing all kinds of great stuff. She's between L.A. and New York a lot these days for some of the projects that she's doing. She really knows her stuff. And this is a wild case, but she has great information, great sources, and goes back decades. And she has generated the trust of a lot of good people. All right, we'll be right back and take a quick break, and we'll come back. We'll take your calls if you're interested at 508-996-0500. Stick around here on 1420 WBSM.